Welcome back to episode 2 of the Change the Balance podcast and YouTube channel. This week, we will be opening up the conversation around inclusion, equality, and diversity, and what that actually means in our communities and workplaces. So, hi, I'm Charlotte, and I'm super excited to be talking about this topic because I think there's so much conversation happening across our spaces that there's probably a little bit of confusion around what equality, diversity, and inclusion means. So it's a really interesting conversation to be digging into today.
So hi, I'm Sabrina Shadie, and my background in EDI, or equality, diversity, and inclusion, has spanned over 20 years, including lived experience and professional. The challenge for me is that in terms of equality, diversity, and inclusion conversations, we end up getting very caught up in the language, in the terminology, in the correct what they're called acronyms. Can't even say the word. And all of the time we spend talking about the language is not time we spend doing the thing that needs to happen to change the balance.
Yeah.
But at the same time, I do believe language is really important.
Yeah.
So it's a kind of a fine line. But that makes people feel really pressured and really under pressure and really vulnerable about what they don't know. So then they don't want to talk about a thing, or, and in fear of offending people. So equality, diversity, and inclusion are the terms that I usually use, but actually my consultancy is ethics and equity. For me, starting from a space of ethics really helps us determine what choices we need to make good change, positive change, and to make that change sustainable.
Yeah.
And then I use the word equity because it's about that individual, unique value proposition that every person has. So when we're talking about reasonable adjustments at work or flexible working hours for parents and all of that stuff, is that equity. How do we make this work for that individual and recognize that individual's value, and not try to sort of pigeonhole everyone and have everyone like in these homogenous groups, because that's not how humanity actually functions. So I chosen ethics and equity because I think they're the two words that really help us navigate that journey. If you can go back to, okay, what's the ethical decision making here? How do I base that on ethics? Usually it's really hard to go wrong. In that context. When you talk about equality, diversity, and inclusion and there's a whole range, right? It's not always just EDI. Sometimes it's D&I, sometimes it's DEI, sometimes it's all different manner of acronyms that people use that feel like it reflects what they're trying to achieve. And I don't think there's a right or wrong. I think for each of us, exactly in the way that diversity is supposed to be practiced, there will be a version that works for each individual. As long as we can all understand that's where we're coming from and the intentions we're trying to identify by using those acronyms. The bottom line is equality in the UK. Equality is around the Equality Act. We based it on a piece of legislation from 2010, which identifies protected characteristics, of which there are 9, and it identifies discriminatory behaviours which lead to organisations potentially being prosecuted for non-compliance. If you can be proven to have been discriminatory against somebody linked to one of the protected characteristics, so your policy around leave is particularly discriminatory to people from a particular religion or a particular gender or something along those lines, you could be prosecuted. That's the baseline. Which it's not best practice, but it's a starting point.
I think it's a really good, interesting point from it's not best practice. And I think the baseline of law is always, and back in episode 1, I talked about this head, this heart, this soul. And, legislation is very head-based. So it takes a long time to get into play. So it's usually out of date before it even, quite reaches the mainstream. Let alone, get signed off before at least meeting the mainstream. So And we're 2010 and we're now 2022, 23, 22 when we're recording, 23 when we release the podcast. And I'm pretty sure within the few months that we recorded to release, nothing much will have changed. So when we look at that idea of diversity and inclusion, I feel that it starts to talk about the heart and the soul of what we're doing. But it's so easy for us, especially as leaders, to get stuck in just the practicalities.
Yeah, absolutely. We get the policy in place.
Yeah.
We ensure there's some training delivered.
Yeah.
And then we move on to the next problem, firefighting subject that needs to be addressed. And that's not unusual. And that, again, it's not about guilt. So in terms of practice, it's about how do we build that into our everyday so it changes the ongoing, rather than, oh my God, we've got to revisit that because we said 6 months ago we're going to revisit the policy. We set the policy up, we did the training, but we've not done anything. There's been no reflective practice, there's been no review process. 6 months in, we don't know how it's impacted, we don't know what might need to be tweaked, because we didn't have a system to enable us to do that in a meaningful way. And I think, unfortunately, we see EDI delivered in that way a lot because it meets the compliance, that baseline. But actually, it doesn't meet the needs of our service users, our employees, our other stakeholders, or actually ourselves as leaders, because we're always chasing our tails. We never feel on top of it. And actually, when you look at the correlation between equality, diversity, inclusion, and mental health, well-being, stress factors, particularly around leadership in these spaces, there's a massive correlation around, good quality EDI and good quality well-being services and how they interact. So having a system helps you with your well-being, as well as meeting your targets around equality, diversity, and inclusion.
Yeah, and I think it's this, like, one person's responsible for the EDI, that it kind of really goes against what Change the Balance stands for. And as a community and as a project that the CIC that Sabrina and myself run, then the whole idea was that we create change makers, we create people who create safe and inclusive spaces. And there's lots and lots of research done around around culture and what culture looks like, and can we measure it and can we not measure it. And when we look at what safe means, we can measure it. If we look at what inclusion means, it kind of means we belong. So what we need for safe and inclusive spaces is trust and belonging and connection. So even though we might not be able to measure in a very kind of quantitative way what culture looks like, from a qualitative way, we really can measure it and what that looks like. And to think that one person is going to come in and revolutionize the business and meet those targets on their own is really naive. And part and parcel of what I really hope is, from the conversations we have just during the podcast, is that we can start to help people understand as leaders that they need to shift that responsibility down. Your CEO can say, right, we need to have more diversity. Our HR can say, okay, well, we've changed our recruitment policy so that we now will take Welsh language speakers is a classic example. We've got the Welsh Language Act in Wales. HR people go, oh my goodness, we've got to put recruitment out in Welsh. Yet we have nothing in place in a lot of the organizations to support that Welsh language to be implemented and embedded. It's just seen as a pain in the butt. And there's not a huge amount of people in Wales that speak Welsh, despite the kind of push for that. But it's just a really good example of how at the top we can have the best directive in the world, and we can have people in HR that are there to help and support that. But unless we've got leaders on the ground floor and staff who embrace those values and those ethics, then it doesn't matter how good your policy is, it means not a lot.
Because it always comes down to the people and the implementation.
Yeah.
And I think, particularly so my equality, diversity and inclusion consultancy is always very much about where the cultural demographics need to be tweaked. So we can look at like a gap analysis and go, these are the areas where actually there's failures. And these are the ways we can target that and make that change. And for me, a big part of that is actually engaging the stakeholders, because they're the resource, they are the value, and that includes, not just, and I think it's a real challenge when you talk about leaders. People don't always understand what you mean by that term. So for me, a leader is anybody who takes on the challenge of being, the role model, making changes, making improvements. You don't have to be a leader with a manager's title to be a leader. You can be a cultural leader in your organization by being the person who champions equality, diversity, and inclusion in that space. You can be a leader by being the support mechanism for the people in your team. That anchor, who provides that kind of, the office mum or the office big sister or the office older brother, who kind of provides that level of support when people may be having a bad day, who notices and goes, oh, are you okay today? You look a little bit down, or whatever that is, and gives people that avenue to not feel on their own, to feel the belonging, to feel the compassion and the care. Those people are just as much leaders, and actually potentially have more impact on the EDI outcomes and on the well-being and on the productivity of their team.
And it's that recognition. We have to shift our thinking in what management and leadership looks like. And in organizations, when we look at those that do deliver really good quality well-being support, that tend to be more resilient, that will put their employees first, they will be more flexible and responsive. But usually that means it's rewarded with less staff turnover, less presenteeism, less sickness. So when we look at what creating inclusive spaces that feel safe, when we look at the impact on that, it's huge from a workplace perspective. When we look at what that looks like from a community's perspective, it can be, for some communities, the difference in life and death. And my professional background is working within the kind of addiction, drug and alcohol space, and been doing learning and development for 15, 16, plenty of years, but I've been working in the sector I've been saying 20, but I've been saying 20 for at least 4 years now. So I think we need to count after 20 years. But when
we'll
we look,
just leave the plus.
Yeah, we just leave a little plus sign there. But when we look at consider the stigma and the prejudice and the discrimination that people experience within their own communities because they, choose to manage trauma or stress through substance, or, they struggle with their mental health and they just don't know how to cope, or all of these different things. And it's a real thing, not having and not feeling safe. And that impact is huge. And it's a real ripple effect that goes far wider than just the workplace.
Absolutely. And I think, when you look at something as simple as the Maslow hierarchy, and you recognize that in terms of equality, diversity, and inclusion, if you start taking away those bottom blocks, or even from the bottom 2 layers, you take away the belonging, you take away security, you take away, you're left with a really unstable Jenga game, where there's literally no blocks at the bottom. And then you wonder why people's work, commitment is a bit wonky when, there's so much lacking at that stability phase, at that kind of foundational level. And I think that's so true for people who come from protected characteristics. When you talk about somebody who can't doesn't feel safe to let their workplace see them in their true sexuality, they don't be gay at work. Those kinds of trying to remember to keep that part of you hidden is exhausting. You haven't got all of your energy to put into your day job now because you've got so much of your energy caught up in suppressing who you are. So that well-being correlation with work, and recognizing that kind of the Maslow or the Jenga piece, where if the bottom blocks are missing, the top's really wobbly. And what we're trying to do is help leaders find ways to make sure the bottom blocks of all of our teams and all of our communities and all of our stakeholders, that everybody has that nice, safe, grounded and secure first couple of rows, so they can give all of themselves when they do come to work. They can feel safe, they can be authentic,
Yeah.
and just see how much that changes your productivity and your outcomes and your engagement levels. And actually, when you ask people to do something that's slightly outside of the standard sort of contractual agreement, how willing they are to provide that a little bit of extra, because they know it comes back to them. They know that benefit is a two-way process.
Yeah.
Game changer.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I defy anybody. So there's a couple of examples I always use when I'm talking about, being human. I am probably not the most communicative person to be challenging when I haven't eaten, because I definitely get hangry. Anybody who's been a new parent to either a child or a puppy will know that when you're sleep deprived, you are definitely not in the best space to be having conversations with them. When we look at just things that we take for granted around feeling safe, when we look at all of those things that we have, where that need for our basic human needs to feel secure, but just picking our moments. And I think we're moving into what could be a recession, and some would argue that we're in it, some would argue that we're nowhere near it yet. And that uncertainty is a real challenge, but that uncertainty for certain groups of people will be tenfold, and for various different reasons, emotionally, financially, psychologically. There's lots and lots going on there, and I think we have to pay attention to those needs. We have to pay attention to, a friend of mine, Louise Westra, talks about the biological bandwidth. And what she talks about there is our ability to process what's going on. And when we don't kind of nutritionally, which is primarily what she focuses on, but when we don't nutritionally look after ourselves, our bandwidth is diminished. We don't have that ability to, think outside of this kind of more tunnel visioned approach. So when we start to think of the challenges that, some of the people will receive from the protected characteristics, and some, I think we openly, don't we, talk about, yes, we've got 9 protected characteristics, but there's plenty of other characteristics where there should be legal protection, not
listed legally,
but aren't lifted. And we'll definitely, I think we definitely need to do an episode on that for sure. But when we look at that constant battle, that constant fight, along with the fact that there might be financial stress, or there might be emotional challenges and battles, it becomes really, really difficult to manage. Absolutely. And we have to do better as communities, as well as workplaces, as well as any kind of spaces, really, at supporting those wider needs.
And that's why targeting leaders is really key, because if we can give leaders, we can equip leaders in whatever term, sense of the word you're using, to help enable those conversations, to make spaces safe, to make spaces inclusive. We can really help people. So the term that I use is survival mode. When I was Aaliyah's parent carer, and she had just come out of hospital, and we were back and forth, figuring out her treatment plan. She was 12 years old. She had no autonomy in terms of legalities and stuff. It was all me, mum doing it all. I lived in survival mode for like probably 2 solid years, where I could just about get my head around maybe a week ahead planning, or 2 weeks ahead, but I could never get further than that. Because there were so many variables in terms of how her health was doing. We could rock up to an outpatient appointment and be kept in for 3 weeks. So we had literally had a bag overnight. Like when you're pregnant and you're close to your due date, you have we're going to hospital bag. We lived with going to hospital bag in the boot of the car consistently, because we never knew when she might have an episode and end up in hospital. So living with that level of uncertainty meant we lived in survival mode. And survival mode is like where you're constantly on edge and waiting for the thing to happen, so that you have to jump up and do that. You don't sleep properly. You don't, and that kind of, I don't like to use the word trauma, because we're great now. I don't have the long-term thing that people think trauma lives, but actually we lived in that. And it has an impact on your mental health. It has an impact on your physical health. It has an impact on your relationship. Like you can't pick a bit of your life that it doesn't impact, because you're living with this thing in the back of your head all the time. And I think that's the case for a lot of people. It hasn't got to be as severe as the version that we lived through for.
I think it is trauma.
Survival mode. Yeah, no,
Yeah.
absolutely.
It's if you look at what trauma stands for, trauma is just something that is almost like a scar to the brain. So, you know, trauma is something that affects the way that we think, feel, and hurt. And if we look at and behave, but that level of adrenaline and cortisol that's floating through your system all the time, that fight, flight, you know, mode, that is really stressful, and that puts a lot of pressure on the body to be able to be heightened. And exactly as you said, that heightened awareness is something that you live, and when your body starts to slow and things start to become kind of quote unquote normal, whatever normal is, but calmer, your body doesn't even know then how to cope with that. So it spikes itself with adrenaline and cortisol just to kind of go, yeah, this is what normal is to us. Why do we want to be calm? It's such a challenge. And if you're somebody who's constantly on edge thinking, when's it going to happen next? When, you know, do I need to watch my back? When are we going to be, you know, back in some kind of unhealthy routine? It's such a challenge.
And the amount of time you spend thinking about contingency plans on contingency plans.
Yeah.
What if? Because you've been put in a situation where you were not prepared, and now you don't want to ever not be prepared. So you kind of take it to a different extreme. But I think a lot of us live in survival mode. I think COVID put a lot of us in that phase of thinking and behaving.
Yeah.
I think the mental health impact of that is going to be something that we are unraveling for many, many years to come.
Yeah.
I think when you compound that with the awareness that's happening around equality, diversity, inclusion, around Black Lives Matter, around George Floyd, around homophobia, around misogyny and gender, you know, the pay gap alone is just, you know, even if you just started there and didn't do anything else, that's a massive piece of work. So there's a lot of people who are living in these quite unhealthy, habitual spaces that we need to be able to talk about and break away from the stigmas and break away from discomfort around being vulnerable, and actually be that helping hand and go, do you know what, it's okay. I'm quite comfortable, as you've just seen, sharing my journey around sort of that really unhealthy mental health roller coaster that is life. And we all react to things differently. You know, I'm quite a resilient person, I feel. However, I spent 2 years completely unable to focus on anything meaningful, because that kind of level of fear and anxiety, I probably was sleeping maybe 2 or 3 hours a night max. You can't function like that. It's really unhealthy, and it has longer term impact. So that is a massive part of why this conversation and creating these spaces is so necessary, because most of the people on the outside thought we were doing fine.
And I think that's a really important part for me, that there's probably lots of listeners who, you know, much like me, will go, God, I haven't really gone through anything like that. I haven't really experienced anything like that. I don't have the fear of, you know, my son walking down the street and being, you know, in the wrong place at the wrong time. But I don't have the fear that he's Black and will he get arrested. I don't have the fear that my daughter will really be in a position where she will see, I generally don't see that she'll have extreme sexism brought towards her. And I think part of that is because I come from a long line of very strong females who've had to battle that. So, you know, by default, we're kind of in a very different mental space than I know lots of people are. But I don't really have to worry about lots of things that people with protected characteristics and around that will have. And I absolutely see the privilege that comes with that. And I think there'll be lots of listeners who'll be listening in saying exactly the same thing. Like, I hear you, but I don't know whether I fully get it. And I think there's lots of things we can relate to, but we have to empathize. We have to have compassion. We have to have sensitivity. We have to try and understand as best we can that story, because you can't keep fighting it on your own. You know, there's only a limited amount of bandwidth that you can use, that you're prepared to use to fight the system or fight what's going on around you. And I think we come back to, why equality is needed. It's absolutely needed because we need to have access to the same the same systems that we've got access to in a really fair way. I think equity is definitely a conversation we need to be having, a whole episode on. Yeah. But when we look at the need for diversity, it's that diversity that brings the stories to the forefront for people like me who are really privileged in that sense. And don't get me wrong, I've definitely come from challenges, but I haven't had to systematically battle against anything. My children don't systematically battle against anything in particular. We have nuances, as does any family. Yeah. But I don't have those challenges. And I think you have to be able to empathize. You have to be able to sit back and listen to stories to be able to go, okay, this is why I have a role to play in creating inclusive spaces. And I think the EDI space in particular, it feels very advocate-led because people like me aren't stepping up and going, I'll fight by the side, let's link arms, let's fight together, or I will fight for you, but you need to work with me so that I know what that looks like. And I definitely know we've got an episode planned around the kind of knight in shining armor and how we don't become these kind of saviors of the people of protected characteristics, for example. But we have a role to play as allies. Yeah. And I think we have to recognize what that looks like from an inclusion perspective.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's the term I would use is always humanity. If we start from a point of our shared humanity, actually, in the same way that the ethics bit, is a really nice standpoint to go. Our shared humanity is the point that we start from. You don't have to understand what it is to be a parent, carer, or a Black, gay young person going through the education system, or somebody with a disability. What you need to have is humanity and go, wow, that person is somebody that I want to support.
Yeah.
How can I make life better for them and everybody else at the same time? Because accessibility doesn't just benefit those people. Accessibility, in true terms, the inclusion and the equality and all of that actually benefits everybody.
Yeah.
Like 99% of the population get to benefit from that journey and that improvement.
Yeah.
Not just the people that it's targeted at.
Yeah, absolutely. And I always think of the examples. I talk about hangry and I talk about, sleep deprived, but I also ask people to think about how many of them poo in public. Yes, it's episode 2 when I said poo. Because I always say most of us as human beings do not want to poo in public. And,
one of those like nightmares, isn't it? Where you the same ones where you wake up, got no trousers on in the middle of the classroom when you're a kid. It's that like being. I had a dream where all the doors on the toilets were transparent. I didn't realize until I was already there, and I was like, everybody in the street can see me. Worst dream ever. Like that's a worse nightmare than being chased, right?
Absolutely. And we can all, we can see and we can feel that. We can feel that, like, oh my goodness, what, you had to poo in the office, you had to poo in school. We feel that. We have compassion for that. And I know it's a kind of really funny example, but it shows that we're really able to empathize with people. If I bit my lip, the likelihood is you go, oh, because you'll be able to empathize with that pain. So we know as human beings that we are able to comprehend at various different aspects of it, but we know that we're able to comprehend, what that looks like. We will fight tooth and nail often if we don't feel we've got equity or, equality for certain things that we feel that we should have. Therefore, we have to be able to extend that elsewhere. So I think, we're just scratching the surface around equality, diversity and inclusion and what that really looks like within our workplaces, within our communities. But it's just such an important part for us to kind of to start with.
Yeah, and it is always hard to know where to start because it's often somebody else's journey and somebody else's experience.
Yeah.
And sometimes sharing your perspective can feel like you're laying something on them that isn't related or making it about yourself, which is why I always say sort of start with the humanity part. Where's the humanity? Where's that conversation starter?
Yeah.
And again, it's the similarities enhanced by the differences.
Yeah, and we've got some just incredible guests who over the next few episodes will be sharing their experiences and what that's meant in terms of, you know, how they've experienced prejudice and discrimination, but also what they've done to just really push that movement forward. And, you know, between us, we've got some incredibly amazing and inspiring people who've just, I feel, pushed boundaries. So when we talk about that, you know, equity and what that looks like, there's so much more to explore, and genuinely lived experience is one of the best ways for us to really build that compassion and empathy to be able to take that next step forward too.
Absolutely.
Amazing. Wow, what a great episode 2. Just absolutely amazing. Thank you so much for joining us. Again, if you've got any questions or you've got any comments, please feel free to contact us. All our contact details will be in the show notes, and we will look forward to welcoming you to episode 3 very, very shortly. Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Bye.